We're so excited to have such an incredible group of creators and executives and all LGBTQ plus voices here to talk about comic books and comic book adaptations. I really want to thank our subcommittee, Bradley Estrin-Barks and Maytal Zahut, who did and put so much energy into getting all of these incredible creatives here, as well as our esteemed moderator, who was also part of the subcommittee, Eric Anthony Glover. Eric was a staff writer and story editor, most recently on CW's Tom Swift, and he's published a graphic novel Black Star through Megascope. And just want to pass it off to Eric and take it away.
Thanks so much, Rob. Awesome. It's great to see everyone here. Thank you to the panelists for being here. I know, like the writers who have attended this event, I hold you all in very high esteem, and I'm just so glad that you made the time for this. Thank you so much. Also, a shout out to Rob Foreman and Spiro and JJ for making nights like this possible at all. Without you, none of this would be running. I want to thank the straight people who have somehow managed to end up here. You guys are the real heroes. And not coming here would have been homophobic anyway. So salute to you. I'm going to read some highly abridged versions of our panelists' bios. They are very long because these people are very accomplished. But right after that, we'll get into our discussion. We have 5 writers with us and we have 2 executives. First of all, we're going to start with Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa. Roberto is a screenwriter, award-winning playwright, and comic book writer. He serves as showrunner for Riverdale on the CW. He also executive produced Netflix's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and the CW's Katie Keene. All 3 dramas are based on characters from Archie Comics, where Roberto serves as chief creative officer. Welcome, Roberto.
Sorry, hi. I'm so happy to be here. It's so nice to be here and see everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you, man. Eleanor Jean is a queer trans woman and frequently does queer trans stuff like fighting for her basic ass rights and roller skating. In the comic space, she's developing the TV adaptation of Kim and Kim with author Mags Visaggio, who's also here with us tonight. Eleanor has also worked as a co-producer and writer on Netflix's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Welcome, Eleanor.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here. Thomas Page McBee. His most recent TV credit is a consulting producer on The Umbrella Academy, where with showrunner Steve Blackman, he constructed and wrote the transition narrative for Elliot Page's character Victor in season 3. So awesome. He's written for the L Word, Generation Q, and Tales of the City, and is currently writing a podcast for Audible about a trans man with supernatural abilities. Welcome, Thomas.
Thanks, great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. James Tynion IV is an Eisner Award-winning New York Times best-selling author and publisher of comic books. He is best known for horror stories like Something is Killing the Children at Boom Studios, The Department of Truth at Image Comics, The Nice House on the Lake at DC Black Label, and manga-inspired young adult stories like the 2021 GLAAD Media Award nominee Wind and the 2017 GLAAD Media Award winner The Woods at Boom Studios. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, full disclosure, James and I went to Sarah Lawrence College together, and before knowing him, I could walk into any room and pretty much know I knew the most about comic books. And now James has won roughly like 78 Eisners, which are comic book awards. So James, I want to congratulate you on being well on your way to knowing more about comic books than I do. So I really appreciate how far you've come, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Mags. Mags is an Eisner winner. Good Lord. Oh, I'm sorry. Eisner nominated. It's fucking close, and it's great. Mags Visaggio is the Eisner and GLAAD Media Award nominated writer of Eternity Girl, Morning in America, and Kim and Kim. Kim and Kim was nominated for the 2017 Eisner Award for Best Limited Series and GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Comic Book. In 2017, Mags was chosen to take part in DC Comics Writer Workshop Program. Her first book with DC, Eternity Girl, was released.
You don't have to read the whole thing. It's so long.
It is long. My mouth is dry from all the accomplishments.
Sorry, I just sent you my standard one.
Oh, that's awesome. That was me editing it down, but it's fine. Thank you for coming to our rescue there. And welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Max.
I'm
Really
happy to be
appreciate it.
here. Happy so much.
Kim, one of our executives. Kim Roberto is the creative director lead of television at DC Entertainment. She works to create and implement DC's long-term content strategy across the media flywheel divisions for film, television, games and interactive experiences, consumer products, and editorial for domestic and international markets. She has developed several new television series, including The Penguin. I'm so hyped for that. Superman and Lois, Sweet Tooth, and more. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. David Sigurani is a queer, multiracial Latinx creative producer. His current credits as executive producer include Peacock's upcoming Dead Day by Kevin Williamson and Julie Plec, AMC Network's The Boulet Brothers' Dragula, Resurrection, and Netflix's Bonding. Currently, David serves as the EVP, development and production for AfterShock Comics, with over 18 film and TV projects in development. In addition to his producing career, David is a proud board member of Outfest and a crisis counselor for suicidal or at-risk youth. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much. Stoked to be here.
Yeah, man. Stoked to have you here. Okay, let's get into our discussion. And for this first question, I would love to hear from all of you on this, if possible. What are some of the challenges of translating an idea from comic book to screen in general? And anyone can jump in, please.
I mean, I think right off the bat, for me, the first thing is that comics usually are centered around characters who have internal monologues. So one of the biggest challenges is getting internal thoughts and feelings to be externalized in a way that's really exciting dramatically. And I think a lot of what's exciting about comics is you do have the words, you also have the pictures, and then it's like, how do you translate that into the movies, into the TV shows? So I think it's all about externalizing a lot of those internal thoughts and emotions.
Great. Thank you, Kim. James, I know you've had some stuff in development before and even currently. Are there any challenges that come to mind for you when talking with creators about this?
I mean, like a lot of them, but I mean, it's been a really enlightening process of the last few years. I've had a bunch of projects in development, but this year is the first time that I've had the opportunity to dive in and like adapt some of my own work. And right now I'm working on one of my own projects. And it's an incredibly enlightening experience. It's writing a comic script is very similar in some ways to writing a teleplay or a screenplay, but the pacing is very different. I've spent the last decade of my professional life thinking about page turns. Basically, every 2 pages of a comic, you want to like figure out, especially when you're writing horror, which is my like main, that's my bread and butter. Like I am often thinking about how every 2-page unit and every page turn over the course of a 24-page issue, and how to build and sustain tension up to every page turn moment, because that's the only moment you can really surprise a reader. Once you turn the page, you are arrested by an image, and then you soak it all in, and then you start reading. And so that those tools I've had to relearn. But as someone who writes a bunch of dialogue heavy comics, it's also one of those things where I have to watch myself, because now it's like an open canvas where it's just like, oh, these people can talk forever. I don't have to worry about like this being boring for 3 pages of just characters sitting in a room having a conversation. But at the same time, I do need to be worried about making everything, visually dynamic and all that. So it's been interesting seeing what translates and what doesn't, and also just in doing and straddling the line from directly adapting my own work and really coming at it from the ground up, and trying to capture the beating heart of it.
You were in a position where you had to learn a new craft. I don't know how often you've written screenplays in the past, but you've had to become better at it, at least to try to make sure this is the best adaptation possible. Are there any particular resources you use to dig into the craft of screenwriting? Were there people you talked to make sure that you would be able to hone your craft here?
I mean, I talked to a bunch of friends who had dabbled in both, both sides of the spectrum, and I wanted to, and then on top of that, I just read a lot. Like, this was I got my hands on a bunch of screenplays, and was like bugging some of my writer friends where it's just like, hey, can you send me this that you wrote on, like, just getting my hands on anything that that works, because I mean, that's how I learned how to write comic books. The comics don't have any standardized scripting format. Everyone writes a comic script differently, so you learn to pick and choose whatever works for you. And aside from hopping into final draft and making sure that it's like, it is like kind of industry standard, I like, it's what I've been taking my leads from, what I liked and what I've read.
Thank you for sharing that. Thomas, I know you were in a really particular position. You were coming into an adaptation of something, and then on top of that, you had to add a new twist to something when it came to the Umbrella Academy. Would you care to talk about how the adaptation process worked for you?
Well, I mean, the Umbrella Academy as a show was already established in terms of like the language and thinking about the difference between the comics and the show. And when I came onto the project, it was already, season 3 had already been written. So basically the first 3 adaptations were kind of done. And I did end up working on season 4, which was a different project altogether because it wasn't actually an adaptation of any particular comic book. So I can't speak so much to that, except to say that it was really the adaptation piece. It was really cool to see the ways that Gerard Way and Gabrielle Ba had this incredible dynamic with Steve Blackman in the room. And it really felt like there was a true give and take, so just in terms of like witnessing the ways that both sort of sides of that creative equation really seem to be understanding their sides of the fence and finding ways to collaborate was really interesting to me to just witness. But in terms of like my piece of it, like when I came on, it was, Elliot Page had announced that he was trans. This was something that happened, organically for him in a sort of moment between production schedules and cycles. And so the timing just worked out that the scripts were locked, and it was like 10 days before going into production on season 3. So when I got the call to like, can you come on and help us sort of figure out how to tell a story about this character, because Steve really wanted to make sure that Elliot's experience was reflected in the character. And it was such a big question, I think, for the show's fans and Elliot's fans of like, how are we even going to do this? And then we had this kind of incredible series of creative constraints between the scripts being locked. So, and the stories are all intersecting, and it's like 8 characters who all have like very specific roles and so on. And on top of that, the season 3 was a direct pickup from season 2. So it wasn't like the story could have been, this character was, had some sort of transformative experience and came back. So we had like a lot of real estate issues and a lot of creative constraints, but I actually feel like what ended up happening was kind of magical for that reason. And so because of all of that, really the story of Victor truly had to be a sort of textural story that sort of slid right into the broader character arc that the character already had and slid into the dynamics that already existed. And to me, that ended up feeling a lot more organic and honest in terms of trans experience. Like most of us don't, it's not our defining character trait to be trans. And it's not the thing that that is the engine of our life stories necessarily. So I think, it was exciting to deal with those creative constraints with Steve, and then actually with Elliot himself. Because the only way I could think of to kind of figure out how to do this best was to just call him directly and say, when do you think this character figured out he was trans? You know better than anyone. And so he kind of pitched, in a way, the beginning of that story. So it was really interesting and organic, very unusual to your point, but I think in some ways, actually so much more reflective of life than what we typically see on screen.
Awesome. That sounds like a hell of a feat, man. Thank you for sharing all that, Thomas.
I wanted
Eleanor,
to say, I really appreciated what Thomas and James were sharing, because I think it isn't a direct lift, right, from the page to the screen. And I think any adaptation, even James talking about like needing to write a comic for page turns and issue to issue monthly readers, I think we forget that a comic issue is like 16 to 26 pages without ads maybe, and that's all you get to tell a story month to month. And they do get collected, obviously, but a part of that is it might only be, you know, your 6-issue arc might only be a pilot. You know, sometimes it could be a season, sometimes it could be a feature. But I think, you know, the way I like to look at it is it does exist for us as a storyboard, and certainly, you know, buyers love to talk about it that way. Like, it helps them imagine what the show or film will be, but it's not our job to make it sort of exist in the other longer adaptation form as an exact storyboard. I think it's about the spirit of it. And Thomas, you said sort of the organic question of what does the story tell you? What do the characters bring out when you get there? And then it becomes a collaborative process, because TV and film is more collaborative in some ways than the comic side, because you have so many more people working at it rather than your artist and your creator and your editors.
When you come to a point where you realize that it can't be a storyboard, that it has to indeed be something different, what are the challenges then? How do you make sure that it stays true to the spirit of what was already laid groundwork wise, but is also something that can exist as an entertaining TV show or movie?
I think, you know, we have the answer to that on some of our panelists right here. Is James and Roberto being involved in their own work is step one. And I think, you know, as a producer, as someone that has worked at, you know, Lionsgate and Turner, a lot of it is, you know, people love to option up a book or an IP and throw away the creator and the author. And look, that's the reason all of us are in love with the thing in the first place. So why would you remove that person from the creative process? And I think having the creator, even the artist, involved in the process is so, you know, important to the entire thing, regardless of who ends up adapting it or what director comes on board. So I think that's one of my first jobs, is making sure that a creator is involved in their own work and that they're a part of the process. And I think that then leads to spirited discussions about organic changes that need to happen, the adaptation process. Even, you know, sometimes like my creators or artists on the comic book side sharing with the showrunner like unpublished concept art, or even script documents that would happen, like James was saying, in the formatting of a comic script. Sometimes a creator is describing to their artist what they want and sort of a source image that they found on Google or whatever. And that kind of thing can help a director or showrunner, a filmmaker down the line actually bring to life the vision of an artist and a writer in combination. I think that kind of thing is super important.
Thanks, David.
I just want to echo that sentiment really quickly. I think it's extremely important that the creators are involved in these projects. And one of the things that we've been doing over at DC within the last couple of years, as we've been, you know, strategizing and building up our team, is really looking to these creators and bringing them into the process much earlier on. So, you know, we can find out what was it that inspired them to write this in the first place? What thematically was it for you that drove these characters, etc. And so when we kind of have their insight, it helps us not only respect what their vision was, but also in thinking of it in terms of an adaptation. You don't want to necessarily just not plagiarize, but just tell the same story. You want to find a way of making it fresh or doing something with it that maybe you couldn't do on the page, but you can do on screen. So I think that for me is always really an exciting time when we can get, you know, from the source what their thinking was.
As a writer, that is really nice to hear. So thank you for carrying on that attitude. Really appreciate it. Eleanor, I was going to ask you, you have this adaptation you're working on with Mags. What are some of the challenges of making sure that you have a new product that is a shining example of what the original work was, but is also something new and something tailor-made for the new format?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, again, just to kind of echo what everyone's been saying, I think getting to work with the creator is so important. I was the comic we're adapting is Kim and Kim. It's Mags's comic, and it's been and it's been my favorite comic for years, and like truly since I got staffed as a writer, like I've been talking about Kim and Kim and like every general I had, because I just wanted to find like somehow to make it, and now it's happening, and I've been such a huge fan of Magdalene. I'm just gonna praise Magdalene the whole time.
Like,
And
thank you.
and so I guess our process of staying true to her comics and bringing it into a new form, we've kind of done it as like the first 4 issues, or expanding it actually into the season. And I mean, for me, it's what's really been important is the spirit of it. Kim and Kim is high energy, very funny, and episodic in its nature. And I think there was just a certain level that, like, Mags and I clicked on as far as our sensibilities. And I don't know, I'm sorry if this doesn't answer your question that directly, but I think the importance of, it definitely hasn't been a lift for like frame by frame whatsoever. It's taking like the story here.
I mean, how could it be? Those comics move so fast.
Yeah, they're so fast. They're in outer space. They're in different planets, and
you only have 20 some odd pages.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's actually been the thing that I've actually been the most like thrilled by from the creator side, is just like, oh, I can like really play with pacing. I can explore characters more deeply. The really fascinating experience has been working with another writer on these characters that have lived in my head at this point for like 7 years, and getting her perspective on them, and getting how have they lived in her head for 7 years, and the process of those versions of the characters, I guess, encountering is this much richer and fuller picture of these women than I ever could have done in the short mini stories that I was doing.
That's really
mini series, not mini stories.
And as like for me, it feels like a unique position, because I was a genuine super fan of this comic, and so those characters have been in my head for 7 years, and so there was honestly nothing more delightful than, like, I love these 2 characters, Kim and Kim, more than anything in the world, and then to meet, like, the one person who loves them more than me, and to combine our visions of them has been just a really beautiful process. It's been, that's it.
Yeah, and I just want to praise Eleanor just for a second for just being an incredibly insightful writer who understands these very deeply complex and flawed young women in this hugely global way that it really just blew me away.
There's still time to make this whole panel about you two just gushing on each other, because it is extremely cute. I had to mute myself from how much I was squealing. That's really beautiful. Thank you two so much.
Yeah, we're adorable.
It's clear, absolutely. Roberto, if you have anything to add, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, I mean, just echoing a lot of that's been said. I mean, it's as everyone on this panel knows, it's so hard to get a group of people excited and passionate about anything, to get anything made. It was interesting. I was kind of thinking what people were saying. I've been an Archie super fan since I was a kid, and I was obsessed with these characters, and it took years to pitch and get people excited about Riverdale, and one of the challenges there was that everyone felt the Archie comics were too old-fashioned and too out of date. Many people thought that Archie comics were no longer published and only existed in the 50s. So in a weird way, it was great when it was like, oh wait, so you invented a gay character. And I'm like, no, Kevin's been in the comics. Kevin exists in the comic books, and that actually kind of helped people see, oh wait, maybe this doesn't exist in in the 1950s. I mean, even that was like a big challenge. Everyone thought that the show was set in the 50s. Ironically, for our last season, we're going to be in the 1950s, but it was kind of fighting against the expectations of that, and then changing the genre. You know, the Archie comics are basically comedic, you know, love triangle stories and things like that, and kind of shifting it to something, you know, more, you know, I'm not going to say, you know, very genre and pulpy and things like that. But it was real. Kevin Keller, I think, helped make Riverdale happen, because he sort of was like, oh, interesting. So it was exciting.
Awesome. Roberto, while I've got you, it's a bit of a good transition to one of my other questions. I'd love to talk about the process of taking a historically straight character like Cheryl on Riverdale, or a historically cis character like Vanya, and putting a queer spin on them. What do you think? This is for anyone who'd like to answer, but please, Roberto, I'd love to hear from you first. What do writers and executives need to know when they want to do something like this?
Gosh, that's a really good question. Well, it's funny. I think the first character that we made queer was actually in the pilot, was Moose Mason. And it was funny because that came about for many reasons. The biggest one was you can't introduce Kevin's, and in the pilot, in the last scene, Kevin and Moose have snuck off from the dance, and they stumble upon the dead body. And originally, when I first wrote the pilot, that was Kevin's boyfriend, who he met at the dance. Devin Davis was his name. And as so often happens when we're working on these things, people said you can't afford another actor. So, and I was like, but Kevin has to be sneaking off into the woods with someone. So we had Moose in there, and I said, oh, what about, no, actually, it wasn't even me. It was one of the other producers said, what if Moose is secretly gay and he and Kevin are hooking up? And I was like, I love this. Of course I love this. But it was sort of like, wait a minute. Moose has been straight for 75 years. Moose that was the first conversation with Cheryl. It's interesting because she was brought on in the comics to sort of agitate and sex up the Archie comics. You know, Betty and Veronica had become both good girls. Veronica started as a bad girl, but then became a good girl. So she was sort of brought in to sort of stir things up. And we hadn't introduced a love interest for her in season 1. And Madeline, the actor, and I had a couple of conversations about it. And she said, you know, I have this feeling that Cheryl's a lesbian. And I said, and we'd had similar conversations in the writer's room. And when we introduced Tony Topaz, who was a canonically bisexual character in season 2, everything sort of started coming together. But I have to say, everyone really embraced that. And there was much more pushback on Moose being gay than Cheryl. Which was interesting and unexpected, and you know, it felt like, ooh, if Moose is gay, is the world going to end? No, the world's fine. The world's fine. But yeah, that was part of that process.
Thank you, Roberto. And Thomas, it sounds like you had a pretty ideal situation with your showrunner, who was generally willing and able and excited to make sure that the story came to life. But if you had any advice to give to anyone, executives or writers, when it comes to making sure an adaptation like this goes smoothly, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really credits to Steve Lappman, because he really was, 100% clear about needing to do this. And it was really, it was about supporting, of course, Elliot's journey, but I think also, if you look back on Umbrella Academy, which people now have done, like you can't look back on that show and not, in terms of the adaptation, not think about Elliot as trans now, and how was he playing his character up until this point. So I think earlier we were talking about the collaborative medium. Like, my background is reporting and writing books before I came into this industry a few years ago. And the way in which storytelling happens collaboratively here is really exciting. And I think being open to that kind of collaboration is, part of the process. So in this particular case, obviously, again, it was organic in that sense. But I think in the broader, when you were asking this question, I was just thinking about, in my mind, there's sort of two things. One is, there's a way that sometimes characters are gimmicks, right? And that's what we want to guard against. Like, somebody gets an idea that it's sexy to have a queer character or a trans character, the Zoomers are all doing it, whatever. And then there's something really inauthentic about that, and people can smell it because it's not real, it's not true, and it's not coming from a place of authenticity. I think that fundamentally involving queer and trans creators in stories in general surfaces queer and trans stories, because we see ourselves everywhere. And we see characters that have been written maybe not with us in mind, but we find ourselves in those characters. And then that's what becomes exciting and subversive, is how do we tell that story? So I think they're really, it's sort of an ephemeral thing to talk about authenticity. It's a buzzword and it's overused. But I think storytellers know how to tell stories, and queer and trans people are really good at finding ourselves in stories. So I think the organic surfacing and bringing these sorts of writers and creatives into rooms and into these spaces is how those stories get told authentically. And there's not really a shortcut.
When there are instances, thank you so much, Thomas. When there are instances in which we don't have a lot of queer people in the room, we are interacting with cis folks, hetero folks who have a lot of power. There's a question of what we do if we're trying to adapt things with queer characters and we're working with folks who don't have our experiences. There's the question of how we collaborate with them when they don't necessarily have a lens that they understand. I'd love anyone's thoughts on this, about how to navigate those pretty murky waters sometimes.
I have a fun thought on this. I mean, for me, I think it's tough because you sometimes will feel like, just as an obstacle in and of itself, identity, like sometimes you're in the room and you're not sure if you're the only queer person there, you're not sure if you have any allies. But for me, one of the things that I always love to do is cite my sources and bring evidence. So I love data, I love research. It all shows that diverse and inclusive content makes money. And I think to get a cishet person really invested, you sometimes have to go straight for the money and just show them that not only are these stories worth telling for obvious reasons, that we are people and our lives and stories matter and are worth telling, but they're worth it in a financial sense. And I think that a lot of the times with these situations, you got to hit them in the pocketbook. You got to show them that it's a financially lucrative, smart endeavor.
Great.
That's such a great point, especially when, again, we're seeing toxic fandom sort of on the rise with Little Mermaid, with Star Wars, with everything sort of coming out of it. And I think part of what we're all doing and we're trying to put out in the world is, as queer people or people of color that are telling stories about our experiences, those stories will matter to someone. That representation will matter. I keep thinking about the TikToks of the young Black girls that are watching, Haley be Little Mermaid, and that's a huge deal for them, and that'll matter even with the trolls sort of bombing everything. And so the more we can put our stories out there, and the more we can even center queer or trans narratives as the main focus point of our stories, instead of just a side character or a piece of a larger cishet narrative, I think that is important, even if sometimes they're not going to sell or they're not going to sort of be marketed the same way. I think just putting them out in the world is going to be meaningful in small ways that we might not even understand.
Thank you, David. Cool. If no one else has anything else to say about that particular question, we can move on. But also, if you come up with something you want to say and you want to jump back to it, that's totally fine. So when bringing queer characters to TV or film, what do you all wish we saw a little bit more of? What still needs work when it comes to adapting these types of characters to the screen?
I'll jump in.
And, all right, cool.
I think you got to go with the behind the scenes. I think it's been echoed through several voices already, but I think we've seen a pretty amazing uptick in media where we're seeing our stories being told. But kind of like what you were saying, Thomas, it's important that behind the scenes we have advocates and people that are championing these stories, but also championing fresh voices and giving people with marginalized voices a platform so that they can be heard. And sometimes it's just as simple as, like, if you're an ally, just kind of making that space and sort of stepping aside and just letting someone have the room and speak. When it comes to, like, whenever I'm interacting with people, I also always try, just as an executive on the, business side of things, I try myself to create a safe environment just by kind of establishing, like, hey, this is a safe space. I'm a member of the queer community. Like, we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. But I think it's important that there's more people like that behind the scenes at the C-suite level, like in really higher up leadership positions. Because it's one thing to have, a group of, worker bees, which you very much need, but it's another when you can have, the leader of a company making those types of decisions. Like one of the people that I love working with and who I admire most is Greg Berlanti. He's like queer icon who has his own production company, and, he gets to establish that platform, and we've loved working with those guys and creating stories through that lens. So it takes sometimes, I think, just a powerful voice in the room.
Yeah, and just to underline that, and I guess what I said earlier, like, I think that the potential of queer and trans storytelling is kaleidoscopic. I mean, we have so barely scratched the surface. And, Gen Z, I think the latest survey is like 15% of them identify as LGBTQ+. So, to the earlier point Kim made about there's profitability here, not that I think that's why anything should happen, but it's certainly, there's a real argument that Hollywood is behind the curve, actually, in terms of storytelling when it comes to younger people and how they see themselves reflected. And I think trans stories in particular suffer from a really harrowing experience of having been sort of created by culture. I mean, Disclosure does a great job, that documentary, of sort of outlining how that's happened. This feedback loop of us seeing ourselves reflected horribly, and then that affects us, and then so on, it goes on, and then that means that the sort of well that you can go to as a cis creator when you're thinking about a trans character is pretty limited and pretty frankly fucked up. And so what we need is to continue to expand, the actual like vocabulary of who people are and what's possible. And I think trans people in particular suffer from the effects of this kind of dehumanizing visibility that's not really visibility at all. And we're just now changing that. So again, same thought I had earlier, but just to keep underlining it, like, the truth is we just need to be in the room because there's so many of us and there's so many intersecting identities, which I would love to see more of. Like, I'd love to see more trans people of color, disabled trans people of color, trans people who are queer identified, trans people who are not. I mean, there's so many stories that have not been told. And that's because people can't tell them because they haven't lived them. And because we've trained our whole culture to other trans people through our storytelling. So this is a ongoing project that we're just all at the beginning of. And I'm really excited, hopefully, to see this change keep happening, but it's really the beginning of where we need to go.
Super inspiring answer. Go ahead, David.
I just wanted to add really quick onto Thomas's about trans storytelling. We need to be in the room and we need to be listened to. And I worked for, side note, I worked for Roberto on a couple of shows, and like I felt that was like a prime example of feeling very listened to in the room. And with a perspective of like realizing that it's like you're not gonna know the story. That's why we're there to talk about these characters. I mean, it's not the only reason we're there, but when it comes to those characters, like we have a version of that story, and it might be the complete opposite of what you were thinking that story is. As far as trans storytelling, like moving beyond the fact that they're trans, expanding our minds in our adaptations that any of these people could be trans, any of these people could be cast as a trans actor, any of these people could be written as trans, because I think a lot of times I talk with cis writers who are and understandably get a little worried about doing something wrong, you know, or even if it's just like someone writing a pilot and it's just like, well, if I make this character trans, I'm gonna have to do all this stuff or whatever. And you know, echoing what Kim had said, you know, I try to, especially in pitches and in meetings and stuff, I always try to set that, like, this is a safe space. You're not going to say anything wrong. If you do, I'll start crying. It'll be really bad. No, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. And I feel like that freedom is really important in the discussions around our characters, but yeah, moving beyond the fact that they're trans, I also, a huge thing, would love to see more than one trans person in a scene together. We have,
tell me about it.
Is there like a Bechdel test version of this?
There needs to be.
It's basic, yeah, it's basically, does a trans person have friends who are also trans? And
Well, because I think the real question is, I know surprisingly few cis people at this point.
in real life, yeah.
I want to live in your world, Mags. That's the world I want to live in.
No, you don't. No, you don't.
Yes, I do.
No, you don't. No, you don't. It's a miserable little bubble. But I actually just want to sort of build on this. Something that I have been so increasingly frustrated by in the especially trans media is we're still in the stories kind of have to be inspirational kind of phase where it all has to be like, look, they're just like you. They're normal. They're just normal teenage girls or normal. And I've written some of that stuff because sometimes that's true, but there's so many other ways to be trans. And part of what's been so exciting about adapting Kim and Kim is I've never seen a TV show that gives a trans woman a character like Kim Quattro, because she's just this absolute garbage fire disaster tornado who does not have an inspirational story and is not trying to reconcile with anybody and doesn't, of course she has trauma, everybody has trauma, but it's getting beyond the usual tropes.
Glad to hear that. David, were you going to say something earlier?
I think Mags said it better than I ever could have, but essentially, like on the Outfest side, as the largest LGBTQIA film festival, one of the programmers the other day was talking to us about the cycle of trans and queer narratives and how first they need to be tragic. So again, we can have empathy with the larger public and, you know, we have our HIV stories and all these things that have already happened. And then they turn into comedy and sort of that best friend character or what have you, and their supporting character, the main character. And then we go into the normalization that Mags was talking about. And I think what we need to see is in that period, we get so many coming out stories. I think every coming out story, right, has probably been told or we've seen different angles on it. What we need is actually fully realized, lived in trans and queer characters, that their sexuality, that their gender identity is not their only character trait, but that they have a dimensional realized life and they live in a life in which they have family members and friends and lovers, and they're messy and they're tragic and they're weird. And I think we need to see that in space. We need to see that in the Wild West. We need to see that in our time. Like, I think we just need more of celebrating queerness and transness in a way that has not been done, because we've been relegated to like needing to speak on the parts that make it relatable to other people. And at this point, we don't need to be relatable anymore. We can just exist.
Yeah, no,
I wish that was true.
You're here.
What were we going to say, James?
Just jumping on that, I really feel like the biggest thing that I would like to see more of are queer leads of stories that aren't queer stories. Like just literally just put a queer person in the center position of the sorts of stories that like, you know, are being told that do very, very well. And it's just like, it opens these genres up. There's new angles to come at with. And I mean, like, that's at the heart of so many of the comics that I work on. It's just like me going step by step through the sorts of comics that I loved when I was like 16 to, you know, 25, and just being like, okay, I'm going to take everything I loved about that and I'm going to put myself at the center of it. But I am like, but that isn't the point. Like, the point is, I still want to tell the scariest story possible. I still want to do my Stephen King novel. Like, that's the sort of, like, that's so much of, you know, my personal goal, and what I also want to just see out in the world. And like, to that end, the other thing that just very selfishly I want to see more of is queer villains, which I know we stayed away from for a while because it was, you know, like, it got a little, you know, there's some problematic sides of it, but I love a good queer villain. And it's just like, those were my favorite characters growing up. And it's because they were the only queer coded characters, but I still love them. And I desperately love a queer villain. And I think that it requires more queer characters in the mix in general. If the only character that's queer is the villain, that's a problem. But you know, that is something I just want to see more of in the world.
Thank you for sharing that, James.
Oh, yeah.
How about you, Roberto? You're in a unique position because you're in a position of power in your room. So I wonder if you felt any freer to just see some of your fantasies come to life on screen, or you've still hit some of the same obstacles the rest of us do.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of picking up on something that James said is, you know, I love so many of the narratives are coming out or tragic or things like that. I love genre pieces that have queer characters at the center, and in horror stories, like so many of your amazing comics, James, you know, it is funny. We have this conversation all the time. What can we do? You know, what I remember when Eleanor and I were working on a story of Sabrina, there was one episode that was sort of an anthology. Every character was sort of trapped in a horror story. And we had a character who was transitioning. Susie was becoming Theo. And their horror story was sort of inspired by kind of Pinocchio. Theo started to turn to you know, rub the lotion on their arm and started to turn into a tree. And we talked a lot about, you know, should we do this? Is it, you know, and then I think, Eleanor, you said, well, Theo's part of the cast. Theo's one of the kids. Everyone else is going through a nightmare scenario. Why should Theo not go through a nightmare scenario? And it was kind of the most chilling of the stories. So we have that conversation all the time. I mean, it's funny. There's a novel that I'm working on, an adaptation, where the hero is queer and the villain is queer, and it's exactly as you said, James. It's like great that there's not just the one villain. Then it's sort of like, but it's great that they're both, and you kind of don't know which is the villain, and it's sort of like a kind of a psychological, sexy kind of Fincher-like thriller, but it's really great to have both a hero and a villain. But this is the conversation we have almost in the room, kind of nonstop, about our queer characters, is sort of protecting them, but not too much. You know, and stuff like that. But similar conversations that we have about all of our, you know, least represented characters or more marginalized characters, kind of very protect them, but then also want to make sure that they're doing the fun stuff that everyone else is doing as well.
Thank you, Roberto. Yeah, so I was in a position, just briefly, just back to David's point about queer people just existing, without necessarily having coming out stories to back them up. I was in a position in my last room where one of the EPs was saying, I'm done with coming out stories. I just want people to exist, and that is it. You will know that Isaac, one of our characters, is trans. He's a trans bodyguard. And everything that was interesting about Isaac had to do with him being a mess. He didn't know how to manage his love life. He didn't know how to balance his life on the personal side with his professional one. He's bullheaded. He's brilliant. He's strong. There's just so many other ways to make him interesting, on top of what's nominally interesting about him being queer or trans. And that liberated us a lot. There were times when our room would go back to like almost being tempted to be like, oh yeah, but like be cool if his coming out story, and our EP was like, I said, and we were able to push forward and evolve that character in a way that was much more interesting than we ever could have handled before. So kudos to those of you in this room who brought up that issue. It is super, super important. I have one more thing before we get into our next questions. For those of you who are attending, we only have a few minutes left before we get to our Q&As. So if you would like to submit questions, now is the time. I'm gonna keep asking our panelists questions, but yours count too. So we'll love to see those in the Q&A box.
Actually, on that note, I need to go ahead and sign off.
Mags.
Because it's like 11 p.m. here.
Mags, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you coming, especially at this late hour.
Happy to. This was lovely. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Awesome. Yeah. Eleanor, you two are adorable, as has been previously established. I am curious though, like the synergy you two have wasn't because you already knew each other previously. And I would love to know in general, like how this group, or perhaps you, would advise anyone who is a fan of existing comic book work, loves an IP, isn't necessarily connected to the author from the beginning, and just has to make their case for adapting a story. What was your story? How did you get things to work out this way?
Well, I mean, I think with Mags and I mean, I was a genuine like super fan. I have like all of her comics. And I told this when we pitched it, you know, it was like a comic I found pretty early in my transition, the first year or two. And it was something that gave me, it was queer storytelling that wasn't like the character was trans, but you didn't, like one of the characters was trans, but you didn't find out until the second issue. And it wasn't a big reveal. Oh my gosh, she's trans or whatever. It was like, she's getting trashed with her best friend on top of a spaceship van and like needs to bitch about her dad. And it happens to be about her transition. And it's just so beautifully brought into it that I don't know, it really inspired me that it's like, I identified with this like fuck up trans woman who's mad at everybody and wants to run away in space. And I think that was really what it was that I identified with that character so much, and I think in turn ended up identifying with Mags so much. But I mean, I don't know, I guess the advice for it, I mean, it's just like I like finding the genuine like feeling of like what makes you so excited about the story, and that's what it did for me. It made me feel I really needed to hear a story at the time that was like queer people get to have like huge adventures in space and get to be fuck ups and then get to do awesome stuff, and like it still kind of works out, and just get to be fully realized people, because I think for a lot of queer and trans people, I feel like there's a lot of pressure, you know, to be, you know, this or that, or like match this narrative or whatever, and that just felt so different. But then I think the advice is just to be genuine. I was a genuine like super fan, and I definitely had people look at me in meetings when I was telling them about this comic like, okay, all right. And I, you know, found there was like, it was like several years into I was actually the guest at the next meeting, Will Graham. They were at General with them. They were looking for something that was like, we're looking for really like queer sci-fi and space, like female-led comedy. And I just like exploded and like told them about this thing. And like, I think it was my excitement that like made them want to go read it. And So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
No, absolutely. That is such a cool story. And James, from the other end of the spectrum, you haven't always been in a position of adapting your own work. You've also been in the position of having to give your work to other people and hope that it would be adapted in a way that was honest and true to your work. Would you mind talking about what that was like?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are a few different there are a few different ways I could attack this question. One thing that I think that, especially if you're coming at this from the Hollywood side, that I would just, internalize in some ways, that so many there right now we're in an interesting moment in the comic industry where there are a lot of these mid-sized publishers, and I've worked with some of them and they're run by very, very nice people, but those publishers have kind of entered a scenario where the publishers drive the media rights for those comics. And then a lot of them, they get anxious when there's direct communication between the original creator of the property and the and the people adapting it, because they, as from the producer side, they are trying to kind of drive the voice of what the sort of thing that they think will sell. That's more of their primary concern, and that's what the contracts say they're allowed to do. So it's but I would just always keep in mind that if you're sort of asking yourself, I wonder if the creator's been looped into this conversation, I wonder if oh, I shouldn't try to bother them about, I'm dealing with this person, but the conversation's moving forward, but I don't want to, get in their way. They're probably busy and all of that. I guarantee you the creator would love to have a conversation with you. I guarantee you they would love to tell you what the heart of their book is and why they wrote it, and in a way that the publishers that they're working for might not have all those answers and might not have asked those questions, and not out of any malice, not out of any ill will. It's not some terrifying conspiracy, but it is something where I remember being up and coming and having a lot of books out in the wild, and the early stages I would never get to have the one-on-one with the person adapting my work to really hone it. And it's one of those things where once I rose a few rungs in the industry, now I get to be a part of those conversations. And and I think they're and then once the companies I work with actually saw how I handled myself when I was a part of those conversations, they continued having me as a part of those conversations, because often I could cut right to how to sell the book better than they could, because I've been selling the book for the last many years. And it is something where I'm I also I want to sell as many copies of all of my books they're all deep passion works, but I want them to conquer the universe. That's my evil goal. So this is so that's the top line thing that I would say, is that while you're building these things, find a way to reach out to the creator. Don't ruffle any feathers. Don't obviously some of these situations you don't want to go too far, but if you ever just sort of oh, I noticed that this is happening, but I'm not gonna call it out, just be oh, I would love to have a conversation with them, and I think that will help in a big way. Yeah, and I mean those are the it goes back to the answer to the first question, is it's just I genuinely believe you look at the most successful adaptations of comics to the big screen and the small screen over the last, many years, and they all had direct creator involvement. Like all of them did, especially outside of, like superheroes, it's a little different, but in the creator-owned space, the creator-owned works that rose up there, like they had someone in the room who knew the books, who like lived and breathed and loved the books, and that it matters, and and I think it pays for itself. Yeah.
Thank you, James. And on that note, I'd love to touch base with Kim and David when it comes to forming that balance between the needs of the screenwriter who's adapting and the original intentions of the creators. You two have talked very favorably about like making sure that the creators in the room getting input from the original vision, which is great. But what happens when there are contrasting interests between the creator and the people who have to make it a good television show or a film?
David, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? I think, it's tough because a lot has changed over the years. I mean, for my company, for instance, like where I work at DC, we have had a TV team only for the last 7 or 8 years or so. It's been a very small team. It's been a very short time of existence, but in that time, we've reached out to people and we've started, trying to really facilitate those relationships, because I think for us, on the superhero side, because I think, James, just to your point, like there is a big distinction between what you're doing with the superhero stuff versus what you're doing with the more creator owned, or like the genre. I call it genre versus superheroes, or capes and tights. And that's kind of how we differentiate it for ourselves. But like when you're adapting things on the capes and tights side, there have been so many hands, so many like cooks in the kitchen and telling different stories about those characters, that when we go to adapt those types of stories, or when we go to tackle those characters, we as the experts at DC who are familiar with our creators and know the works, we'll try to curate what we think is like really awesome and exciting, and then try to like, get our other execs in the world to read those and help educate them and teach them about the universe, while also explaining the importance of speaking to the different people who have different perspectives on these characters. So I think DC and Marvel in particular have really, really long legacies. DC's been in existence for over 80 plus years, and those stories were created and characters were created during a time when the industry was dominated by straight white men, and we're living in a time where that's changing. Those stories are no longer, those perspectives are no longer the only ones that are allowed to be explored. And so I think that's one of the biggest benefits that I find in talking to the creators, because somebody who's writing a Batman comic, for instance, today is not thinking about the same things going on in the world that, may have been happening when the character was first created. So I just think that there is a big distinction between what's happening on the supers versus what's happening in the rest of genre, but you have to talk to the people telling those stories in order to really understand them, as James was saying.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think part of the problem, right, is I've been in studios where, like at Lionsgate on the film side, we had Hunger Games and Twilight and those franchises going. And to tell you the truth, like those authors were not involved at all. And they were pretty unhappy sometimes about the changes being made on their work. And so part of my growing in this industry as an executive and as a producer is seeing some of that, and seeing some of the calls and the emails that would come in, and seeing how these people could have bettered those franchises if they were involved. So I'd like to think that now, and certainly moving forward after that point, I've kept creators involved in all of my projects that have been based on some IP or even life rights. When I've done a show like Bonding that's on Netflix now that was based off of, you know, a story that I overheard at a meal and basically then worked with that writer to make it into a thing. And so, you know, part of, I think what James has said and even what Eleanor and Mags have presented is it's important to, you know, look at the comic industry and as writers adapting comics and find the publishers or the writers that have the rights in a way in which they can be involved and to be working with those publishers and those writers rather than maybe companies that might be more involved or might push those creators out because it's not going to be a benefit to the project. And I think I would be a huge advocate as well, since I work with a company that has a publishing arm, to really as growing writers in this industry. And if you're a WGA member and you've gotten a few staffing credits or you're getting on your way, like Eric is an example of this too, like go and publish a comic, like don't just do one or the other, you know, find a way into comic storytelling and be someone that can themselves adapt their own material and show sort of my side of the table and the buyers and the streamers that can be done more and more. And I think one of the really awesome things that I've been able to sort of push for in the last year, even with people like James and Roberto being examples of comic writers that have moved over and done that, you know, as I've been able to move some of my comic creators that we have a showrunner, we have a director on their project and packaged around them. But when we sell it to a network and a streamer, then I'm pitching them for the room to staff them for their first TV credit that they've ever had. And it's because, hey, guess what? We all wouldn't be here unless that writer created this world that we all love.
Exactly.
So why don't you give them the fucking chance to like write on their own show? Thank you. And it's worked a few times and I've been able to convince some people. So I think part of that is the strength in the team that you're building, and as writers, like find the people that are going to actually give you that pathway and stick with those people rather than choosing companies or publishers or folks that are not going to do that.
Now I want to just go have a drink with David so we can exchange more stories of how many times we've had to like have the conversation. Like, please just listen. A creative consultant.
Oh, awesome. David, that was a super inspiring answer. And thank you for yours as well, Kim. Awesome stuff. Yeah, I have one more question before we go into the Q&A section. So those of you who still want to submit questions, please, now is the time. We've had a bloodbath when it comes to the Warner Media Discovery merger and the decisions that have come afterward. Lots of shows canceled in the superhero space, in the comic book space, with a lot of queer principal leads. That's been disheartening for me personally. And I wonder if people in the audience feel the same way. This question is for any of you. What would you say to queer writers wondering how to still get their stories told in this space that seems to be minimizing their voices right now?
I would love to jump in on this.
Please, get it.
I am also heartbroken, you know, over the loss of some of the shows that we've, you know, had to say goodbye to. But I do think that there's always chaos in a merger. There's always, you know, heartbreaking things that occur, but there are still people that are advocating and there are still people that are championing voices. As David, you know, said, he is an advocate himself. I'm an advocate in my own way. You know, when it comes to staffing rooms, one of the things I like to do is try to make sure that there is, you know, some kind of equal representation happening in the room. If there are too many male voices, for instance, I'll start only suggesting female voices. Or, you know, if there's not queer, if there are no queer voices in the room, or if there haven't been any queer voices whose names have come up on lists, I will only suggest queer names at that point. So I think it is all going back to what Thomas so beautifully said earlier. It really is about, I think, having people like us there in the room to advocate for each other and for our stories to be told. like I said before myself, sometimes you're in a room and you don't know if you have any allies. You don't know if there are any other queer people there. Sometimes I'm the only woman sitting at the table, and that's a fun experience. But it's like there are still good people in this world. There are still good allies and people who want to help you help other voices be heard. I think it's just about being your authentic self and speaking up when you can, or if you feel safe enough. Sometimes I understand, like, you don't necessarily feel like you're in a safe space, but at least for someone like me, like a bullheaded blue collar girl from Philly, I'll just say what's on my mind.
And thank you for doing that. That was a really, really touching and inspiring answer. It was a tough few weeks there, looking at what was going on at the place that houses like my favorite characters of all time.
Mine too.
So it's really nice to know that you've been an advocate behind the scenes. Thank you for doing that work.
And honestly, just to add really quickly, one of the more exciting things that we haven't really gotten to talk about publicly yet is, you know, some of the stuff that we've been designing behind the scenes strategically. I'm gonna be a blasphemer and give a little praise to the good old friendly neighborhood rivals over at Marvel. I've always been a huge fan of Young Avengers over there because it was like a whole queer team. And I was like, this is the coolest fucking thing I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like this. And so for me, you know, when we've, over the last couple of years, we were charged with filling the YA or co-viewing bucket, you know, the bucket where everybody can come and watch. We put all of our favorite, you know, teen queer characters right at the forefront of that strategy. And I can't speak to the specific characters just yet, but there are some really exciting things coming down the pipeline. And, you know, we do hear you. It's just hang in there a little bit longer and you'll see all the good stuff starting to trickle forth.
Thank you, Kim. I want to make space for anyone else answering that same question before we move on to Q&A, but I don't want to force you to answer that question either. So if you're good, we can certainly move on to some of the audience submitted questions.
Yeah. Hey everyone, Co-Chair Rob again. I just wanted to, before reading some of the Q&A, and also just want to give a huge thank you and applause to everyone on the panel and our moderator, Eric. That was such an incredible conversation. So thank you all for sharing your experiences. It's funny, a couple questions ago, James had mentioned wanting to see more queer villains. And in our last committee meeting, we actually voted to do a queer villains panel that is currently being just like, it's in it's still the early stages, but there's something wicked in the queer water. So maybe we'll all get back together for a family reunion. So I just felt I had to say that and tease an eventual another panel that the committee is going to be putting on. So I'm just gonna probably pass back and forth with Eric, just reading some questions from Q&A. So if you got them, pop them in there. Also, our staff liaison, Keith, I believe I'm only seeing them as anonymous, so I can't call people out to say, hey, do you want to turn your video on and ask? But we'll see what happens. So our first question seems to be for everyone who wants to answer. If you are reimagining a straight cis comic book character into a queer trans character, how do you navigate the balance of being true to the IP while also making the LGBTQ identity a genuine aspect of the character?
I just immediately thought of the character Dreamer from Supergirl. We had a character, so I'm going to just tell a little bit about Dreamer because this was just such an amazing story. Dreamer is a derivative character. So we talked a lot about legacy earlier and how do you take something that has like 80 plus years of legacy and adapt it for a modern audience with queer sensibilities. And I think, the character Dreamer, who was played by the amazing, effervescent Nicole Maines, was originally based on Dream Girl, who was a character from the Legion of Superheroes. And our Dreamer on the show is trans. The character she descends from, the character that is in her lineage is cishet. So what was really cool about this specific story is that in Dreamer's family, every generation, one woman inherits the ability to see or dream future events. And Dreamer, as a transgender woman, is the female of her generation that receives the power. So for me, it was such an inspiring, awesome, amazing moment. It's kind of like when you think about, I'm going to say a little bit out of school, but when you think about Wonder Woman's Island of Paradise and who is welcome on the island and how you treat gender and sexuality and, identity, it's like those stories matter, and that is a space where those people can also exist. Like, we had a conversation not that long ago about core immutables. I saw one of the other questions was, this ties a little bit into like advice for writers and how to adapt. We always look at core immutables. I don't know if that's one of your favorite phrases, David, working in comics, but for us over at DC, core immutables mean like what makes the character tick, what makes them who they are. And we've never felt that it had to do with what they necessarily look like. It has to do with their emotions and what they're going through, their journey, their struggle. So for us, it's like you can take that legacy and you can adapt it in a way that honors and preserves the powers and, what the original intent of the story was, but through the lens of someone young who's living today, who is queer and experiencing this and wants to see themselves reflected back to them in the superhero media they're consuming. So that was one of my favorite things to be a part of.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. And allowing a pregnant pause for anyone else to jump in before we get to our next question. I could just read the next one. Kim mentioned that she uses data of how queer stories make money in order to convince cishet people they're worth making. Kim, do you have a go-to case, or do you have go-to case studies you use when you're making this argument? What are the best resources that you found makes the most compelling case for this?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know, please anyone feel free to chime in as well. But I mean, for us, we do have a really wonderful team of researchers that we we ask questions to, and they go out into the world and help find those answers for us. So we do have our own internal team, which is really helpful. But we also do partner up with other organizations like GLAAD, for instance. They always have some really incredible resources. There's they not only do they provide resources for the LGBTQ community, but it's also for women, it's for people of color. It's like they have statistics on all of these people. You can just go on their website and download it. It's like right there. And I mean, half the time, the data matches with what we want to do anyway. Like, we want to tell queer stories because we feel like they matter. The data matches with that. So sometimes it's just a matter of putting a piece of paper with numbers in front of someone to just show them like, hey, here's a little bit of proof. But as far as like a go-to case study or, a specific resource, I think GLAAD provides some of the best, information. And again, I have to give props to our internal research team. They've helped us understand not just the LGBTQ community and what kinds of stories and characters people are craving, but how we can also make our stories inclusive on a global scale. Because I think what's really key is that you know, when you look at the Justice League, or, you know, you look at Teen Titans, those are Americans, those are American characters. And I think even beyond our sexuality, it's like there's people that are not American. There are other cultural experiences that exist even in the queer community. So I think for me, I love getting the data that tells me about each of the international territories, for instance, and like what kind of TV do people, you know, in Brazil watch, what kind of people do, or what kind of TV do people in Norway watch, et cetera, so that we can kind of figure out what excites them and kind of infuse that into what we're doing. It's almost a way of like, sometimes it's like dangling a little carrot where you're like, we have this story that you're interested in, and it just so happens that there's a queer character in at the helm, or something of that nature, you know. But it's like, I do whatever I can to try and get our stories out there.
Thank you, Kim.
This next question is super interesting. It's kind of about reverse engineering. What are some bits of advice for film and TV writers who want to adapt a movie or TV show idea into a comic book or graphic novel form? So I guess, you know, certainly our execs, but also for maybe our writers who have done that themselves, or taken something that they thought might be a movie or a TV idea and actually got it into the world on the page.
The first, oh, good, got it. I'll follow up.
Yeah, like one thing that I would just say is, you know, like you need to make sure at like the start of the process that you are like respecting the comic book medium. Like this is a, you know, something that has become like, you know, there are a lot of people who, because, you know, especially over the last several years, a lot of comic IP is like a way to, you know, get your work in front of it's like, you know, you have something physical that you can put in front of a producer, like that helps you. And so something that at your heart, at like, but the goal is still the film or television. And that is the thing that it's just like, that might be the goal. That might be where the end point that you want to get to. But when you're sitting down and you're considering like, I want to bring this to the comic book medium, you need to sit back and think like, okay, in the same way that like, as I'm adapting one of my own series for, you know, for television, there are certain visual angles to that story that, you know, like that would be too discordant, like, you know, for me to approach in the exact same way. So I have to rethink, like, and I know that I want a discordant note, but it's just like, how do I create that discordant note using the visual language of television? You know, one book that I, you know, highly recommend reading is it's the book Understanding Comics, which, you know, it's a very like, you know, it's like they teach it in all of the, you know, comic schools and all of it, and it's just like, it feels very there are some, it has some basics of the rules of comic storytelling that are just great to ingrain yourself with. And it's a book that I reread every couple of years, and it's by Scott McCloud. So it's just like, I would hunt that down. I would read some comics and like engage with what you were trying to create. And then as you're trying to do it, it's like in the same way that you're trying to find you know, like take the beating heart of the thing that you want to be a film or television series, and then take that beating heart and figure out, how do I tell the comic version of this? Not how do I take an existing thing that is fully broken down and all of that I want the producer just to see the, you know, see what I see as the potential of this. It's like, you also have to consider, it's like, what does the comic book reading audience want? What would they connect to? What are they connecting to right now what's selling in stores. Like you need to sort of like, you know, there's a bit of homework to do, but you know, and I encourage you to do the homework.
That's exactly the answer, and part of it is they should not be a one-to-one sort of adaptation in terms of putting your TV show or film idea into a comic. I think everything that James brought up, you know, you really do have to rethink your entire story. You might have to rethink your characters, but you also have to think about the medium. And I think it's important to understand what medium you're working in and why something would work different in a comic than a TV film adaptation. And to me, you know, and we have sort of in some ways taken either writers or filmmakers that have never done a comic from TV and film and help them with our editors make their first comic, but also we've done it the other way, obviously, of getting some writers into adapting their own work. And part of what I try and share with people is you should look at a graphic novel or a 5 to 6 issue arc as maybe the feature, maybe the pilot, but it's not always the same, and it's fluid for every story. And ultimately it takes understanding what visual panel storytelling is like, what turning the pages like, what issue to issue sort of cliffhangers and bringing that readership back is like. To add to James's awesome book recommendations, Scott McCloud also has another comic called Making Comics that is just as important, because it teaches you the process of, as a comic writer, you're going to have to work with an artist, you're going to have to work with editors, you're going to have to work with a letterer, a colorer, and these things are probably not a process that you're used to, but thinking in visual ways on a 2D page is going to be different than writing, you know, filmic description for a director or for an actor to pick up in performance. And Will Eisner also has a book called Graphic Storytelling, and it's about telling stories in a visual narrative on the page and how that's different from TV and film. And so I would recommend to everyone to pick up and know your stuff, but also be open to the fact that, you know, your story needs to change in drastic ways, and you might need to rethink or re-break your entire reason for telling the story. And that's okay, because you might create an IP that you as an author will be published, will have something on a shelf that you can pull down, and you may never get a TV or film project made. And sometimes people have entire careers not producing a credit to their name. So be proud of that. And then hopefully, if your intention is to lead to TV and film, hopefully that can be a signpost of, even if you take an idea or the title or a concept, or like we have talked about, the spirit or the heart of the thing, that's still worthwhile, and you still had sort of a roundabout process that is successful, and it doesn't have to be one-to-one, you know, back and forth or adaptation at all.
Thanks, David. And if I could briefly jump in here, on the craft side of things, I adapted my first ever graphic novel from one of my own screenplays, which was never produced. And if you were like me, you came from the school of thought or the school of being taught that as a screenwriter, your job is to minimalize your voice as much as possible, keep everything spare from the dialogue to the prose. You are, at least with features and pretty much with TV in my experience, you're trying to seed power, giving it to everyone but yourself when it comes to a creative vision. That's what I was taught. That isn't necessarily good, it's just what I was taught. And when it came to writing a graphic novel, I had a lot to unlearn. My artist, her name is Ariel, was lovely, so patient. And she was going to need that patience because I was someone who didn't know how to write a graphic novel at all. I was doing it for the first time. There were times when I would just hope that she would psychically understand what kind of shot I was looking for, because in my experience, I've been told that that's the director's job. You do not touch a shot. You don't write that into the script. Take your ego out of it. That was my whole MO, because I was told that was the right thing to do. And wow, I mean, what a wrong way to approach an extraordinarily visual medium, where I had a co-director, and I had to recognize that I was a director too. I had to take a little bit of the liberty of being able to write maybe a paragraph instead of 2 lines to describe a shot and truly tell Ariel what I was going for. It was mentioned a bit earlier, but I brought visual aids and I let Ariel say like yes or no to those. There were times where she gave me, I said this is going to be brief, but here we are. There were times where she gave me layouts of things that she wanted to do that improved my story that I hadn't thought of because she was there. But I needed that kind of help because the screenplay had just become this kind of bare bones exercise where I was kind of this ghost and I was writing a blueprint. And that's not what comic book writing is at all, in my experience. When you're trying to go from writing a screenplay to writing a comic book, you can feel free to take just a little more power for yourself. Your eye is what's going to make this entertaining, and there's still going to be someone you have to collaborate with, but you do not have to make yourself fade into the background. People are there to engage with you, to play in your sandbox, have fun with it. That'd be my craft advice from my crash course that I got a year ago.
Well said.
Well, thanks. We have another question. What advice would you give to an LGBTQ plus staff writer on a show run by a cis or straight showrunner who are dealing with queer characters and stories, but not feeling entirely heard or represented when it comes to being rewritten by higher level straight and cis writers? So, gosh, in these instances, it seems like the people in the position of power are cis and straight. The people who are not in the position of power are not, and they're not being heard all the time. How does one deal with that?
I have some very real advice, I think. It's not the advice I want to give, but maybe the advice that's necessary, which is like, as a staff writer, you have very little power, right? So pick your battles and be really strategic and thoughtful about how you want to deal with that, but just really try to pick your battles, because what you really need is mental health and the capacity to have a longevity in this industry and to kind of keep a sustained interest in what it sounds like you have, which is like a genuine desire to disrupt this model that is systemically broken, where the staff writer who represents the marginalized group is the person with least amount of power, and then you're trying to convince people who are telling your stories or stories that relate to you that how to do that, and they're not listening. That is a problem in so many different ways right now in rooms, and I think it's the way that you can really, or the way we can all kind of get screwed by that, is if we exhaust all our emotional energy trying to save someone else's story from their own, from their own failure of understanding and empathy. And so I think letting people fail is okay. I think saying your piece and having your own integrity and picking your battles, but really just trying to think about, how do I sustain my own career, and how do I make sure that I resolve this issue going forward as I get higher and higher up. And as you get higher and higher up, you will have more and more of a say. So there is like a light at the end of the tunnel. But I know that's not like the sexiest advice, but it's really, for me, that's been my experience. Like you pick your battles and just don't exhaust yourself over other people's inability to listen to you.
Totally agree. And just want to add on to that, I'm someone who puts a lot of pressure on myself. I think there are other queer people who do that too. And that's all of us. And I think, especially when you're the only one of a certain identity in a room, at least in my experience, I put a lot of pressure on myself. And it's like, you know what, if there is something that is a fight that like you lost, or you really feel like it's not going the direction, it's like Thomas said, it's picking the battles, and it's knowing that, like, I feel like the weight of the whole community can feel like it's on your shoulders, and I feel like sometimes the environment makes it feel that way, but that's not true. That's just not true. If this goes through and it's I feel like I can spiral out of control if it's like, oh, if this is offensive to, or other trans people see that, like I'm gonna lose my trans card, or or whatever. It's just, none of that is the case, and I think it is about, like Thomas said, about longevity, and at the same, because the other token of that is like the stuff that we make on our own, and the stuff we're developing, and the stuff we're pitching. you know, that's where we can, you know, die on all of our hills, like, because this is our thing, you know, this is our thing, and we but I so I that's where I try to redirect my energy. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Let's go to the next one. We kind of touched on the topic a little bit earlier in passing, but didn't really dig in. As storytellers and creators, how do we combat toxic masculinity in our industry and fandom to someday get a bisexual Superman or a gay Iceman comic character onto the screen? The internet is dark and full of terrors. Go.
I'm already afraid. Well, we have our bisexual Superman in the comics. I know the question is talking about on screen, but the son of Superman, John Kent, was recently he recently came out, and you know, I would love to see him on screen someday. But it's so new. I mean, I think it really, as far as these iconic characters go, I think the more people speak up about the versions of the characters that they want to see, the more people listen at the top. I think it's a precarious, sometimes political game we have to play when it comes to certain characters. I mean, I think there's still a lot of battles. There are still a lot of battles to be fought. But as far as toxic masculinity in our industry and fandom is concerned specifically, I think what I've come to find is that there's usually a very large or very vocal but small group of people that are the toxic ones. And I think the majority of fans and the majority of people consuming this media, they're good people. And I don't think that, you know, they're as vocal. So I think if you are an ally, again, just like you kind of use your voice and support. I think that's all you can really do. But we try not to, at least I try not to listen to the toxic minority that is like on Twitter. I don't know how you guys deal with it, but I know fans can be really intense to the point where like they'll pause the screen and like, you know, analyze what's on it. And I know Roberto and David, you guys come from the world of comics and adaptation, so you guys definitely know how crazy that can be.
I just have to say, I am obsessed with the bisexual Superman comic book.
Is he not adorable and amazing and perfect?
I love it.
Right?
I love that character. And I don't know when this started happening, but it feels like over the last year, especially DC, has been doing such great God's work with the variant covers that I talk about money talks. I'm like, I want to buy this comic book. I need this cover. And if these comic book covers had existed when I was 11 or 12, I think I'd be president of the United States right now, because
I literally
it was
made
like, I'm like,
yesterday.
this is incredible that this is a Nightwing comic book, you know. And it just reminded me, like, one of the first kind of adaptations I did was a very unofficial adaptation of Archie comics where Archie was gay, and it was a play. And I got into I mean, it was totally unauthorized, and I got into so much trouble. So it's incredible. And I do think representation, even in a comic book, is the start of that journey to the big screen. But I love the Son of Kal comic book. I'm so happy about it. I just bought a new one today.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I can take zero credit for that. I work in TV, not publishing, but
still,
super fan.
Yeah. I love that comic too.
Yeah.
Big time.
Great.
Yeah.
Keep your eyes peeled for more. I think, like I said, I think DC, there's been a lot of change. And I think it's just about a matter of using your voice when you can, especially in fandom, fans of the media are vocal to begin with, but it's getting the good folks and the supportive folks to use their voices that I think is sometimes the challenge.
I'd love to add on to that. I worked in a particularly great room that was completely anti-assholes, very, very, very against toxic masculinity, to like a kind of Edenish degree. It was just a paradise of people who were very decent. And anytime anyone asks me what my experience is like, I just gush about them because I want to. But I think one side effect is that it's normalizing what I value. And I think the best way we can, it's pretty indirect because we don't have power all the time, those of us who are trying to come up the ranks as writers. But when it comes to destroying toxic masculinity and creating more of a space for people who are anti that, I would say shout the praises of everyone you see doing things right every time you can.
Yes.
That's going to mean a lot to them when it comes back to them, but also just the principle of it. It shows everyone that all of us really, really care about this issue. So if you're in a position to, whoever asked this question, that's what I'm trying to do so far.
Get all your friends to tweet.
Yeah.
Beyond that, get all your friends to pick up the comic books. Like, this is, the other great way to vote is with the wallet. Like, absolutely. This is a, because I spent 10 years writing superhero comics at DC, and as like a fairly prominent queer queer creator, I definitely had I never got the firestorm that some people that I'm very close to have gotten, but this is in learning like how to engage, or not engage is the wrong word, figuring out how not to engage with that aspect of the fandom, and out of some deep like a very powerful chip on my shoulder, and all of it's so much of it is about endurance. Like, so much of it is about, like, this is, we have made extraordinary ground. Like, we've taken extraordinary ground over the last decade in in comics in particular. Like, I remember just a few years ago, some of the things that are happening right now in, like, specifically DC Comics would never have happened. Absolutely not. I know because I was in the rooms where those ideas were shot down, like, in extreme ways, and seeing the people actually able to step forward with them is like really, really something. And I am like, that's the biggest thing that I want moving forward, is just like, I want to make sure we keep the ground we've taken, like, because we're going, like, knock on wood, we're all gonna be around this industry for a very long time, and the goal is, and that during that time the culture is going to swing like a pendulum from like moments of like conservative moments and like very liberal moments, and we need, in the moments that the pendulum swings in a direction that is not in our favor, we need to make sure we hold on to the ground that we've taken. We need to make sure that we continue to support each other and make sure that we keep each other in this industry. And it's all about community. And that's one of the things that, frankly, the other side understands, is that, like, these, the reason some of these groups, these fan groups, feel like they're so like all encompassing and all powerful and can dominate the conversation is they've built these little communities where they like share and support their own ideas, and then they go out and then they torment people online. And it's just like, we need to show that our community stands together as well in the face of that.
Well said.
Thank you, James.
I just want to add on to Eric what you were saying about singing praises of spaces where like the opposite of that is happening. I think I'll probably speak for Thomas, and like we the last writers room I was in we were an all trans writers room, and I believe the first one that's ever happened in Hollywood. And it was also a very like idyllic Eden experience for all of us, just being like trans nerds in a room who didn't have to, I mean, I could talk about it for hours, but like we didn't, there was just like all the characters were trans, we were all trans, and that was it. And we didn't have to talk about all of the other stuff. And we got to tell incredible story that definitely has never been told before. And a huge credit to it was our showrunner and the way she ran the room from day one. And I've been someone who's been singing the praises of this, and I think it's just I think it's important to remind ourselves, or at least for me, I get really discouraged and think like, well, it's just the way this industry is, if we've got to like, you know, like, and it's like, no, it's not. These spaces can work differently. There can be spaces like that work really well. There can be spaces like Roberto's rooms where everyone is listened to. And I mean, I think on Pretty Little Liars, it was like almost an all-female room, and that was really important because like all of our voices were integral to that and were heard. And I think it's just kind of popping that, at least for me, that illusion that it's like, well, this is just the way things have to be done. And it's like, no, this is just like a certain type of person that's dominated this. And, you know, I think as queer people, like we learn to trust our instincts and trust ourselves. And I think we can do that in storytelling as well.
Yeah, just to jump on, just because Eleanor's so right. I was thinking about that room as the whole time we were all talking, and I just feel like now I need to make a little counterbalance to my earlier advice, because I think that's actually what I was thinking of talking to the staff writer, you know, in the situation they were describing, because exactly, like between creating our own work and also actually there is a whole new school and generation of people who are changing the industry right now, including in leadership. And that room in particular was amazing. But I've worked for now multiple showrunners who I think are really trying to change the way rooms are run and change the way stories get told. And I think there's a real genuine push to do that. And to James's point, it really is about singing praises and also like continuing to build that coalition out together and like making those values known. But I think there's a real hunger for that. And so that's why there is light at the other end of the tunnel.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. There's kind of a corollary to this in the chat. And then I had kind of a popcorn question that I wanted to ask based on what everybody was talking about so eloquently. But in the chat, how do you, as an adapter of a beloved IP, or as the creator of it even, engage with the positive side of fandom?
I mean, for me, it's why I love conventions. Like, you know, I've started going back to them over the last few months, and it's incredible. It's incredible to actually, you know, it reminds me so much of why, like I remember being in their shoes. I remember going to San Diego for the San Diego Comic-Con for the first time and sitting in panels, listening to my favorite creators. I remember, you know, like dreaming of walking like through this world and being a part of it and getting a chance to, you know, write these characters that I would just stay up late at night and like imagining stories about. And, you know, getting to like when you actually get to engage with the fans face to face, especially away from the internet, away from all of it, it's just like there's so much love and deep passion. And it's just like you remember and like my favorite are seeing, like, because I have fans that, you know, because I write, you know, hard-edged horror books and also like, you know, young adult, like, you know, queer fantasy books. And it's just like my favorite things is when like the guy who looks like he's gonna come up with a stack of the, you know, all of the hard-edged horror, the scariest stuff that I've done, and he has the stack of the YA books and he wants to talk to me about like, you know, like, you know, someone who's like, this is the first book they've ever read with a queer lead, and like they're just like delighted by it, and it's just like, oh, it's so fascinating that you can approach fantasy from this angle, and they've never thought of it before, and it delights them. Like, then, you know, and then it's like seeing the flip side where it's like my queer fans show up and they love the like real messy dark horror stuff, and I love having conversations with them. Like this, it is just like you engage, you get to see and feel the, you know, like the vibrancy of the people actually engaging in these works. And it's the, you know, it's why the conventions are exhausting. Like at the end of a convention season, like give me a month, I'm going to be like, oh my God, I never want to go to a convention again. But they can bring so like until next season, and then I'll start going again. But then it's like, it brings so much like love and joy, and that, you know, like that is one thing that I know is a little more difficult to replicate on the TV side, in the TV film side, but it is like just such a, I'm so grateful for the world of comic conventions and like store signings and stuff like that.
Thanks, man.
Incredibly uplifting.
As a relative noob, I'd love to just say one small thing, which is that I'm not someone who has a big history in the comic space. So Umbrella Academy was really my first project in this space, and I had no idea what to expect, and I was a little bit scared given that there's such a rabid fandom for the show. I just wasn't sure how they were going to react, you know, and so I was blown away by the response that people had. Really long-term fans, like super fans of the show, who really embraced Victor's story in particular, and I think I found it like incredibly heartening, especially given the kind of, I guess I was sort of prepared for the worst, and it really, I mean, there were obviously people who were going to have their feelings, but it was really inspiring actually, and I felt like instructive way beyond the comic space or beyond even the industry, to see how fast people could adjust, you know, and understand, and you know, it just felt like a much bigger thing to see that reaction. So the positive side, at least in my experience on this show, was really phenomenal. And it really kind of went against, I guess, the stereotype of what sometimes superfans supposedly can act like.
Awesome. You know, I think we're going to be wrapping up at 9 o'clock. So I think the first question in the chat right now is an amazing question to end the panel on. So if Mercedes is here, and if she's willing to throw her video on and ask her question of the panel, otherwise I'll read it out. I'll do a pregnant pause.
Oh, she doesn't know how to do that.
Technology.
That's okay.
That's not a question. So what do you feel were the best ways that showrunners you've worked for have made rooms feel like a safe space? Or for Roberto as a showrunner, how have you made everyone feel the room is a place where everyone is heard?
I can start. You know, it's funny. I've been really lucky. My almost every show I've worked for, my showrunners have always been queer people. My first show was Big Love, and that was run by Mark Violson and Will Sheffer, and they were writing partners. They were life partners who got married during the show. And then I worked for Ryan Murphy, and then I worked for Greg Berlanti. So I never went up, you know, with that. And you know, it's funny. I feel like when I started, I think the era of like true. I mean, I'm sure there are still pockets and stuff, but the era of true like horror stories about, and you know, like some of my friends who have been doing television longer, 15 years, 20 years, however long it is, those incredibly shocking stories. You can't kind of believe that they happen. I have been very blessed and never experienced that. And, you know, Ryan and Greg, so inclusive, and then I think at the forefront trying to set the tone and say, if you're in this room, if you're at this table, and I've never been someone who's like hung up on writer's title. Like if you're a staff writer, if you're a story editor, if you're a I don't know what I truly don't know what most of the writers' titles in the room are. If you're in the room and you're at the table, it's because we want you to be at the table and we want to hear your voice. I have been occasionally in rooms where I've been either mid-level or whatever, and someone will say something to a staff writer, and it's like, why are you doing this? Like, this person is here, they have something to contribute. You didn't hire this person, someone else hired this person. But that's, luckily that hasn't been the norm. Again, in my mind, it's like, if you're at the table, there's so much that we need, so much help we need showrunners to make full shows. You're just there and try not to think about things like titles and things like that, and yeah, just kind of try to be respectful and accept that other people have different points of views, and that and they may be right and often are right.
Yeah, and off of that, as an executive producer that has put together several rooms, I want to sort of speak up on the fact that you are hired for a reason. You went through staffing both on the studio side, the producer side, the network and buyer side, and sort of your voice is integral to that room, and the showrunner has chosen you for a reason. Sometimes you do have to navigate politics, and you have to navigate everything that is sort of the bad side of being in a room and being a lower level writer or otherwise in that space. But remember as well that you do have people on your side that can be advocates for you, like a Kim, like myself, you know, someone that either you met with as part of the process, or a producer that you might know that has been in and out of the room, or that you've met on set when you're producing your episode or something. Like, do go to those people or lean on those people. And, you know, I want to reiterate what Thomas said too, is like, ultimately your mental health and your experience and your career is going to be the most important thing. So tread lightly, but also see who you can lean on, even if it's, you know, someone within that room that is an advocate for you, or can just give you advice on when to speak up or how to pitch something in the room or talk to your showrunner. And hopefully you'll find that in a room that you're in.
Cool. All right, Rob, did you want to give us that
The
final
floor is
Q&A
yours,
question?
Eric.
All right. Well, all right. This is for everyone. An anonymous, really fun question to end the panel on. Thank you, Rob, for thinking that way. What is your dream cishet legacy comic book character you hope to see a queered up adaptation of?
My dream was realized. I was in the 90s. It was all about Superboy and Robin being queer, and like that was what all the fanfics were about. Like Roberto knows what I'm talking about. Thomas, everybody's like nodding, like, yes, you guys were all part of the same live journal communities as me. I got my queer bisexual Superboy, and I got my queer bisexual Tim Drake Robin. I got them both in the same year even.
I'm ready to see a polyamorous relationship between Cyclops, Wolverine, and Jean Grey, so that they can
I
all
please have that? Can they just be a throuple?
Yes, I want that so bad. And we all know it's there and it's subtext, and I just
totally
want to see
there.
it happen.
The comic I read growing up most religiously was Wolverine, because he seemed so trans in retrospect, and I just don't know why the world doesn't understand this, and I feel like it has to happen. So
can we talk about how his OG height was 5'3"?
that's what I'm saying.
I'm here for this.
I mean, all of these are great examples. It's funny. I when I was a kid, I was always in love with the Jimmy Olsens, the Dick Graysons. I was always like the young ward of. I was like, I would love to date Jimmy Olsen. I would love to date all those characters. So any of them.
Eleanor, were you going to speak?
Oh, I was gonna say one, and this is for Kim, if you want to take this back to work. I've always seen Poison Ivy as trans, and
oh my God, that's genius.
that just needs to happen. But also I really want like a trans lesbian like action adventure story on Themyscira. I was like, that's really
just you wait. Just you wait.
Oh, okay, great.
Just you wait. We'll talk.
I have to echo Kim's, it was Tim Drake for me for forever and ever. Like, I used to run like a Tim Drake Tumblr when I was in like college, and yeah, so I scrubbed the internet of like all existence of that, like when I started writing professionally for DC Comics.
I'm gonna send you an email too, James.
But no, I was just, yeah, it's like, you know, I was so happy it was happening, but it was like, I wanted to do that.
Hey, still good. You still can tell those stories.
I have one out of spite. There was a time when Miles Morales was a new thing and the internet was going insane. And Brian Bendis was out here just like, hey, created a new character, also named Spider-Man. And it took my breath away. I was so touched by that. And don't quote me on this, but I think his co-creator, Sarah Pichelli, said something to the effect of, and why can't we have people like this, like Miles Morales? Why can't we have like a black or a gay Spider-Man? Just off the cuff. It got quoted. And then like just the internet went nuts. Like, what are you talking about, a gay Spider-Man? She didn't actually say Miles is gay. But now, out of complete spite and pettiness, I'm going to have to answer this question with Miles Morales must be queer in some way going forward whenever he's on screen in a live action adaptation of anything.
From your lips to the powers that be.
Thank you. Yeah. Rob, did you have anyone in mind?
You know, it's actually not from an American comic because I'm a huge manga fan and I'm obsessed with the magical girl genre, particularly Sailor Moon. And I would just love to see the queer take on the magical girl genre. I think it's ripe. But yes, also like very much Connor Tim Drake stan over here a little bit.
This room knows what's up.
We know what's up.
It was there.
Yeah. Well, we're a little past 9 o'clock, but thank you so much to this incredible panel. Again, a huge round of applause to our panelists, to our incredible moderator, to Eric. This has been so informative and such a wonderful, free-flowing conversation. Thank you all for being here and being queer and talking about it. If you are a WGA member in attendance, again, our LGBTQ plus committee meeting is this coming Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. And you can find an RSVP link on the Guild calendar. And we'll start off with our guest speaker, Will Graham, co-creator of Amazon's A League of Their Own. And before we end, just again, another huge round of applause for everybody here. So thank you.